Everybody. Oh,
Yeah.
that's nice. Loads of people coming in. Loads of people from all over the world. So that's fantastic.
Okay.
So I guess we could, what do you think, Thomas? Do you want to
I guess we could ease into it, right?
ease into it? Exactly. Ease into it. That's probably what we need after the last 20 minutes of trying to sort out the technology.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Uh,
So flexible hip joints. Yeah.
yeah. So Jackie Davis just wrote today. I wrote and used the water flowing out through my knees imagery, and did it
Mm.
work?
Yeah. How did it go, Jackie?
Yeah, that's always interesting then to hear if it was successful or if it didn't help. That would so. But yeah, so flexible hip joints. I mean, we touched on
Yes.
it yesterday because it's so connected to the
Yeah.
stability of the lumbar spine. At least in my experience, for me, that was those two were very closely linked. And in students that I taught, it also seemed to be very closely connected. If the lumbar spine is wobbly, hips are stiff and locked, right? And if you're stable around your lumbar spine, then all of a sudden it frees up the pelvis.
Mm.
So,
Yeah. And I think one of the things that helps from a Feldenkrais perspective is that the clearer your sensory perception is of the structure of the hip joints. So in other words, you have this sort of shallow cup-like joint, and then you have the head of the femur. And when you are very clear about the structure, it becomes easier to imagine how all the movements possible can be available. Um, so that's something we might look at tonight, Thomas, is maybe just briefly look at the skeleton of the pelvis and the hip joints, just so that people can get a bit of a feeling for that.
yeah,
And
great if you can share that software. If you,
yes, I will. Yeah, I will.
I think somebody in that Facebook group was saying that would help her.
Yes, I actually saw that, so I thought it would be a
Yeah,
good time to share it.
yeah, and
So we can, and with this guy here, the beauty of it is that he starts with all his muscles, and then we can slowly remove the leg. This here that I've got my arrow on is the inguinal ligament, which goes from the pubic bone onto the iliac crest. And it's pretty much where the join of your thigh is onto your torso. But if we take off a few layers, you see all this incredibly complex musculature around the hip joints and around the pelvis. And then maybe when you see all this, it becomes a bit clearer why it's difficult for the hip joints to be free, because the moment that you have any loss of balance, as Thomas says, in the lumbar area, or you topple a bit forward, all these muscles will grip and stop you from falling, basically, which is a little bit what we were talking about last night. But let's
yeah,
strip it back down. And some of you will have seen this before. This is kind of my favorite app. I love it.
I know it's
So now we've just left with a few inner muscles. And if we go to the lateral view, because that's quite key for riders, I often think that, you know, when you're giving a riding lesson, Thomas, you're often watching riders from the side,
yeah,
aren't you?
yeah,
So when you
typical.
get the feeling of the femur hanging
Right.
and the ball of the head of the femur is in the hip socket,
Mhm.
it can give you an impression of the small range of movement that you're going to be wanting to be able to absorb the movement, yeah,
Right.
in through the joints of the legs.
Mhm.
We can
Oh,
take it to a posterior view too. Yeah.
yeah.
And then one more view which I like is from above.
Oh, yeah.
So this is the pelvis from above, the pubic bone around to the iliac crests, and you see that you've got this sort of bowl-like structure, really.
Mhm.
Um, and the hip joints are kind of a little bit lower than halfway down the pelvis, and you've got all this stuff below the hip joints, your sitting bones, your pubic bone, and your tailbone. And that part of your pelvis really needs to be free, free from the legs. So
Mhm.
if all these muscles here, the adductors, are too tight, it kind of grips the inner thighs onto your pelvis and makes it that much more difficult to find this, what we were calling yesterday, this combination of dynamic stability and suppleness,
Mhm.
that I think differentiates really good riders from
Yeah.
the rest of us. Yeah. So I'm going to unshare the screen now, I think.
Mhm.
If I can get back onto the Zoom bit. Yeah, stop share. and we can take it from there. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah. And oh, by the way, Jackie had said that, yeah, the water image really worked
Mm.
for her.
Mm.
And yeah, Luke says here, images and explanations help a lot for me to understand. That's very good.
Yeah.
Just as explaining the skeleton. And I was just, as you were talking about this, thinking of two observations I had made over the years in writing that always puzzled me a little bit, but now in retrospect, they make sense, having met you and having had some Feldenkrais lessons myself.
Yes.
I had one student who said she was doing like 150 sit-ups every day or something, or regularly. It was probably more than I could do at the time, but her seat, was weak in a way,
Yes.
and my seat was much stronger, even
Yes.
though her abdominal muscles were probably stronger than mine. So I thought, that's interesting. So it's
Yeah.
obviously not strength. It's
It's
more
not about,
coordination, balance, whatever, right?
yes.
The other thing is then we had students, one in particular, who had very stiff hips when she was on the horse, but when she did yoga and other exercises, she was hypermobile almost. So I thought, this is interesting. So obviously stretching muscles is not the answer, because she is very flexible. So that can't be the problem, that the muscles are tight. Because I always used to assume if your hips are stiff, your muscles are tight, right? So
Yes.
hamstrings and so on. So you need to stretch those. That was always my thinking back then, but seems to be wrong.
Yeah, and I think this is what's so interesting, is that as I said yesterday, strengthening yourself, strengthening your muscles, having strong muscles and having flexible muscles is important, but they don't necessarily change your coordination. And in order to change your coordination, you need to learn to be aware of how you're moving, and also the possibilities of movement. So often what happens in an exercise class is, and this could be yoga or it could be a gym class, is you take yourself in with all your habits and movement habits and postural patterns, and then you strengthen those with the exercises that you do, because you're not actually aware. First, you don't even know that you're doing them because they're your habits and they're unconscious. And B, you don't have any other options for movement or for moving better. And I think that that's one of the key things about Feldenkrais, is that most of the lessons, within the framework of the lesson, is a combination of becoming more aware of the unhelpful and faulty patterns that are stopping you being able to do what you want. But also the lessons include new ways of moving, which tend to be more optimal. And I think this is really, what sets Feldenkrais apart from most other exercise methods. And it's really not really about exercise. It's about awareness. It's about, the way that our brain messages to the body in order to move as effectively and effortlessly as possible.
And I guess it's also about exploring options and alternatives, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Dressage riders were conditioned in a way to think that there is like one right way of doing it. Everything else is wrong. So I have to try to find that right way and do that, right? And don't look left or right. Don't try anything else. Just try to do the right thing, right? And then it's easy then to get, aggravated and to force it. And
yes.
I have to push more and I have to, and then of course it's counterproductive to do that. And I like that Feldenkrais philosophy of just exploring different things, like how else could I move,
Yes.
and
noticing the changes in quality as you do that, which is what basically you're doing with your horses as well, is that, you notice that in a movement like the half pass, that it's easier on one side than the other, or maybe one side of your horse doesn't bend as easily, or the ribs get a bit stuck, and or one leg feels a bit stiff. So this is very much what we're doing in Feldenkrais. We'll start with a movement, and you notice the quality. You notice which parts of you are working too hard, more than you would want to. You notice when you over effort and you hold your breath. And so you're constantly using this sort of sensory feedback, this kind of loop from brain to body to brain to body, and assessing, oh, that helps. When I do that, that helps. That makes it better. Oh, that wasn't so helpful. If I have my foot here, I'm stronger and more powerful. If I have my foot here, I don't feel that way. I feel weak.
Yeah, and when I didn't have a teacher for a few years, and I basically had to use the horse's feedback to improve. I stumbled upon some of these principles, I guess, on just exploring. And I thought, well, what else could I do? What can I move? How could I move? What other options have I? Because what I'm doing is obviously not working, right? So repeating that over and over and trying harder, doesn't help, makes it worse maybe. So what else could I do? And so out of desperation, sometimes I did the exact opposite of what I thought I needed to do. And that was interesting. And sometimes it actually worked.
Yeah.
So, it's like in turns, inside hip forward, outside hip back, spiral seat. That's what we had been taught. And sometimes the horses just wouldn't turn, they would turn their head, but they would keep going straight. And so I thought, well, now I'll do the opposite, outside hip forward, inside hip back. And sometimes then the horses suddenly turned like a little train on tracks. It's like, wow, look at that. That's interesting.
Yeah. And when you're aware enough of your body that you can feel what you did to cause that, then you can repeat it. Yes.
Yeah, very important. That you keep
very
track
important.
What did I do? What did the horse do?
Yeah.
How does that relate to each other? And then just change what you're doing to see how does the horse respond to that when I do it this way. So it's interesting. It's interesting, huh? It's exploring. It helps sometimes to think of what options do I even have, in what dimensions can I move, with various body parts, and then try to explore the range of motion and just see how the horse reacts to that, So what makes him better, what makes him worse, and those kind of things. That's and then yesterday we were talking about how when you can't ride, you can do this at home on a chair or something, on a bench,
Yeah, there's actually a very cool thing you can do to discover how to let your hip joints go almost on the spot. And I mean, if you're sitting on a firm chair, you can try it. You just sit at the front edge of a chair so your thighs are free, and then lift one heel a little bit away from the floor. And then if that's easy for you, you can lift the front of the foot as well. And then you see, can you let that leg just fall? So some people may find that they can kind of stamp it down. Some people might be able to place it down, but can you truly let go of the muscles around your hip and let your leg fall to the ground? And if you're sitting there and trying it out now, it would be interesting to hear, how successful you are. And the other thing which will tend to happen is if you lift one leg and you let it fall and you feel like, yeah, I've got a pretty good falling leg there. And then you'll try the other one. And then you'll probably start to notice there are differences between the two legs. One leg is, for most people, one leg, it's harder for the leg to, you see people are coming in. Jackie says, my right leg can fall, but my left leg won't fall. It will only stamp. Exactly. And that gives you a really good feedback for when you're on your horse, maybe why some movements are more difficult than other movements. If your left leg is busy gripping on the hip, around the hip joint, then you won't be able to shift your weight equally easily in both directions. It's just a little experiment, but even in the lifting and the falling, if you do that several times, probably the muscles will almost get a memory of being able to let go a bit more.
Yeah. And most dressage riders tend to be control freaks, so I think for us it's especially hard to let go and let something fall.
To let something fall. Yeah, and I don't think that's unusual, actually. I think falling is not something that human beings, unless you're a stunt man or woman, stunt person, be politically correct here, it's not something that we do much after we leave school. Maybe if you're doing martial arts, that would be an example. But learning how to fall, to really let your body weight go in a particular direction is an interesting challenge.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
And with this movement I've just told you about, the leg falling, it's kind of like the smallest fall you can make.
That's true. Yeah. Very true. How interesting. Yeah. So here's Kevin is just reading. Kevin McGetchy says both were pretty good. Would this affect the weight you could place in your stirrups when riding? Probably, yeah. Yeah,
it would affect your leg position, and also this sense of which we talked about, of the hose pipes for your legs and the water pouring down. if you're holding onto your hip joints more than you need to, it would affect that sense of flow.
Yeah, that's actually it's an interesting train of thought, because if you're tight in your hips and you can't let go, so the leg hangs, then you'll probably tend to lose your stirrup because your leg is always pulled up a little bit, right?
Yeah.
And other people try to gain stability or security by pressing down into the stirrup, like a permanent pressure bracing against the stirrup. That would be the opposite. It's like the stomping down of your foot, probably, right? Correlates with that. And the other one would be the not being able to let the foot fall and holding it up. So that's interesting.
Yeah. And I think that about feeling that things feel pretty even. I think what you can get is a level of being able to discriminate, where you're able to detect such small differences that you will start to feel that even though both are pretty good, there probably still are differences. And it's these really small differences which are barely detectable, which actually, I think, ultimately make the difference in terms of being able to aid your horse really lightly and really easily, and for your horse to be able to hear what you're saying. So it's, I know certainly when I started with Feldenkrais, I was always been pretty well coordinated and athletic, but the level of refinement I got through doing the lessons was something I couldn't have imagined. And I'm still today, it's over 20 years, I'm still finding refinements in myself where I suddenly notice something small that I hadn't realized, and it makes a big difference. It makes a big difference to my ability to ride well, or I'm primarily was a skier, so that's where I tend to notice these things most.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, and let me see. There was something that occurred to me. Now it's gone again. I'm trying to keep track of the comments there, so then I got distracted here. About the legs. One thing we could talk about too is in what way tightness in the hip shows up in riding. And I don't know if everybody is aware of this. Before I get to that, now I remember, because you were talking about differences between the two legs, like one may be easier to drop, the other one less easy to drop. And the horse's hind legs tend to be slightly different because of the crookedness, the natural asymmetry. So when the horse has a bit of a tighter, stiffer hind leg, then it's often more difficult to get into that and sort of melt into that hind leg, because the horse doesn't give you a very good place to sit. So you feel like with the one seat bones, you're sort of stuck on top a little bit, and it's hard to let go of your hip there, and it's hard to let the leg hang because the horse doesn't invite you in that much, right? And when the hip joints, especially of the horse, have relaxed and everything feels soft, it's a lot easier to just sit there and let the leg hang, and while the horse is still guarding and holding, it's a lot more difficult. The trigger is probably contractions in our body too when the horse tightens, and vice versa. If the rider comes with hard, stiff, tight muscles, the horse braces against that and defends himself against that because it's not a pleasant feeling.
Yeah, and I think it's important to mention, actually, I think it's a really good point, Thomas, is that whenever you're doing a balance sport like riding, you will be falling in and out of balance. That is just what happens. It's but maybe the degree by which you do that lessens as you get more skilled.
Yeah, true.
And nobody is perfectly balanced all the time. It's just not possible.
True, very true. Yeah, and it's as you get better, you don't lose balance as extremely and not as often, and you get back into balance sooner. That's probably one of the big differences between the good riders and the not so good riders. The beginners are mostly out of balance and have a really hard time getting into balance, and the more experienced you get and the more coordinated you are, the easier it is to be balanced, stay balanced, and you can regain balance quickly, because basically you've been there so many times, losing balance, regaining balance, that you know what to do to get back. Right?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And you also, I think you learn to detect the sensations which almost preempt that moment where you are out of balance. So it's like you get these little subtle cues that tell you you're going in that direction, so you can correct yourself a lot faster.
And the good rider has the advantage of being able to balance the horse in such a way that it's easy to sit, right?
Yeah.
The horse is well trained, easy and soft and so on, with the back lifted and everything. It's easy to sit well, you know. But if you have a horse that's very unbalanced, with the back dropped and narrow rib cage and croup up and so on, they're very uncomfortable. So it's very difficult to sit well in spite of the horse, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually, I mean, of course, in that example where your horse is crooked or stiff on one side and hollow the other, be grateful that you've got a hip that can hold on a little bit and stop you falling down one side. You know, we need these, our faulty patterns, so to speak, because they are what help us to survive in tricky and challenging moments, and they need to be really automatic. And it's more when everything is going well, and as Thomas says, you know, your horse is more balanced, that you might be able to start to, you know, to really feel the more subtle things going on. You know, you can really work with your sensory perception. If you're fighting with your horse just to balance, then, you know, it's a bit survival at that point, isn't it?
Yeah,
and then
exactly.
all of us will go into our patterns. You know, that's just how it is. And there's something in there for me about accepting that we can't always feel just wonderful and free and balanced and well coordinated.
And it's true. I mean, when you think of the training of a horse, if you start with a horse that's out of balance and stiff, and because it's a retraining horse, maybe it was badly ridden, then initially everything is pretty big and crude in some ways, you know. And then as the horse gets better and more balanced and more supple, things become more refined, aids become more invisible, it becomes more effortless to sit and go with the movement, and then you observe a lot more details, and everything becomes finer and more in depth, more detailed, and you can explore a lot more nuances in a way. It's not all black and white and on or off, you know, like flipping a switch on or off, but then you can explore all the shades of gray in between black and white. You know? That's when it gets interesting then. So. And it's difficult to work on like the finer points of the seat when you have a very unbalanced horse that's very stiff, you know, because it doesn't really allow you to do that yet. Yeah.
And I guess that's why, you know, in Germany, so many people have lunge lessons, don't they? Because it does give you the opportunity to be able to concentrate on yourself and not have to worry about, you know, the controlling your horse.
Yeah, in the old schools, you know, it was common for students to be at the lunge line for a long time and develop the seat and to get lunge lessons on well-trained horses. And that option basically doesn't exist anymore. But like in the Spanish riding school, that's the way they did that. 3 years of lunge lessons every day, you know. So, and then of course, that helps.
Oh, this is really interesting comment from Cecilia. She says, right leg could fall, left leg stamp. What to do to balance myself? My left side is weak and holds tension. And Jackie says, I think the magic is that, to Cecilia, is that by discovering this in ourselves, we are already part of the way to the cure. Absolutely spot on. So in other words, if you had never noticed, Cecilia, that you had these differences between your two legs, then you wouldn't know what to work with. So the first step is awareness of what is more difficult for you than you had imagined. And then, you know, we're going to give you some tools in this series this week of some short lessons, Feldenkrais lessons, that may help you, almost like a detective, sort of find some ways to get a little bit more symmetrical in your use. I think we're going to post a couple of the lessons that we did from our series in January at some point during the week, which may give you some clues, I hope. But yeah, you know, so often exactly, you're spot on what you're saying. You know, you feel this difference in your two sides, and the stiffness and tension that you feel is located in a whole pattern of movement through your whole body. It isn't just in an isolated part. So you need to kind of understand how a stiff hip results in something in the ribs which is not quite working as well as you would like, and something all the way down your left leg, and how you balance and how you use your head and your eyes. So it's a process of getting to know yourself. Yeah.
And Jackie had written a comment there in response to something I had said, which basically repeats almost what Catherine just said. She says, you were suggesting that the tension that we hold in the hip joint translate through the other seat bone and the thigh and the foot, and so the whole of the side that is holding on more is more rigid to the horse. Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's
kinetic chains, in a way.
Mm.
And stiffness in the rider creates stiffness in the horse.
Yes.
So the body part of the horse that's in touch with your stiff body part will tend to brace back against it, just as a defensive reaction.
Mm.
And it can work the other way around too. If the horse is very stiff and rigid, our body may want to tighten up and defend ourselves, because it's an unpleasant sensation.
Mm.
And then it's like instinctive, or it's like a reflex. And
and actually a few people are saying that they've had injuries, and I think Anna Zaradnik, I hope that's pronounced right, had a very bad accident and punctured lung and broke a lot of bones. It's so tough after something like that, because you've got the trauma of the body, and even when the trauma in your body has healed, you're left with trauma in your brain. So your brain will still be protecting that side. And Feldenkrais is great for that, because we do work with this sense of a neuromuscular re-education, if you like. I'll post a link to the Feldenkrais Guild of North America, because I think that's where you are. And she asked about people willing to work online. Everybody is willing to work online right now. That I can pretty much assure you, because we tend to do hands-on work normally, and teach lessons face-to-face, and none of us can do that. So there will be people who are very, very happy to work with you if you want to work with them. But you've got to change things in the brain. I mean, I when I broke my leg, even 5 or 6 years on, I had the best I can describe it as, there would be a sense of fear, very deep internal fear around certain movements, even though my leg was completely healed. And it made my right leg stiff, and it made the whole of my right side more contracted than it needed to be. And it took quite a while for me to gain the sort of sensory confidence to be able to use my right leg in the way that I had before. So it does take time.
You see it in horses too.
Yes.
When they get an injury, they often guard that body part very much, even though they're long healed and nothing should be hurting. The vet says they're all clear and everything's good, but the horse often doesn't believe it. They don't trust it. They think that used to hurt. I'm sure it will hurt again if I really put weight on that hind leg or whatever, if I really, move a certain way. And then it can be a little tricky to convince them to try.
Yes. Yeah. And as you say, if even for your horse, if your horse is frightened that something's going to hurt every time they put a weight through a leg, why wouldn't they be hesitant and brace and be reluctant?
Yeah, exactly.
And we're the same, despite the fact that we have these brilliant, frontal cortexes, they don't have so much effect on that kind of thing. It's no point. It's not actually very useful sometimes to say, I'm perfectly okay, because the sensory motor part of your brain is saying, no, you're not, no, you're not, no, you're not, no, you're not.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And I think you need to have a lot of experiences after you've had an injury of moving comfortably and easily on the injured limb or whatever it is, before that kind of little fear reaction goes away.
Yeah. Yeah, very interesting. Yeah. It seems like it's
It's a big thing, eh?
A lot of people had injuries, and it makes things more complicated, makes things more difficult.
Yes, it does. And you get these sort of layers of compensation. When you look at babies moving and small kids, there isn't much of this stuff unless they've been unlucky. And then gradually, as we go through life, we it's maybe not even injuries, but we copy the way our parents move, or we copy our peers, and we develop a teenage slouch, or we want to be cool, or we're shy, and all those things create layers of these muscular contractions, which make us recognizable to everybody. Miles away, I'll say, "Oh, look, there's Thomas." I can see the way you move, but they are also a consequence of our history, if you like. And so what we're looking at here is, how can we recognize these contractions from our history and see, are they really necessary for us now in our present lives? And can we free ourselves of them, lose them a little bit, and reclaim our birthright for fantastic movement.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, so interesting. And yeah, so I wanted to get back a little bit to yeah, why is it necessary to have mobile hips when you're riding? You know, why would anybody care? You know, or what happens if you don't have supple hips? Right? And it's a really central issue. You know, I think a lot of people hold tension around their hips, and that interferes with a lot of things, like losing stirrups, for example. That typically comes from a contraction of the hip flexors that raises your knees, and then yeah, you tend to you keep losing the stirrup. Another problem, you know, if you contract the hip flexor muscles, is that your knee comes up, your lower leg goes too far forward. A lot of people have their lower legs too far forward, where they can't feel the horse and where they're not balanced. So then they're in a chair seat, right? That's a typical result of stiff hips. Then, of course, the big one is also not being able to sit the trot, you know, and bouncing. That typically comes from stiff hips. And yeah, I always think of hip joints and knees and ankles as the shock absorbers of the rider, you know, so that you don't absorb the movement of the of the horse's back so much with your lumbar spine and thoracic spine and so on, but much more with your hip and knee and ankle joints, because they have a much bigger range of motion, right? And when you look at riders who bounce on the horse, you often see that the pelvis and the femur, they're locked in the same position, in the same angle, right? So when the horse's back goes up, the rider's pelvis goes up, and the knee goes up too. And then when the horse's back goes down, the pelvis goes down of the rider and the knee goes down. So there's this constant, you know, and then it's usually more or less out of sync with the horse, and there is a little, you know, delay and bounce. And if you think of keeping your knees in a way as far forward downward as you can, so you know, like you're kneeling in the horse, and then trying to keep the knee in the same location, so it doesn't move up and down at all. It's just in the same place on the saddle, but your pelvis goes up every time the horse's back goes up, and it comes down when the horse's back goes down. That's only possible if your hip and knee joints open and close, right? If they flex and extend. And for me, that was a helpful image in improving, you know, the sitting trot and being able to follow the movement more. And every time I felt like my knees were rubbing up and down, I knew my hips were tight, you know. And that, I mean, I had
That
times
is so interesting.
I had open sores on my knees because, you know, I was holding tension, especially one side. That may have been the right side, I don't know. And yeah, so and then when the hip joints were relaxed enough, legs turned in enough, then that stopped basically. Then my knees didn't slide up and down. I didn't get any sores on the insides of my knees or the back of my knees. You know, if the legs turn out a little, then you tend to get little sores on the back of your knee too. And that's just a lack of mobility in the hips and knees in a way.
Yes, well, I think it's really a coordination and organization thing. In that the moment you feel, what is it like to have these possibilities of movement in the hips, the knees, and the ankles? This sense that there's this adjustability and the suppleness and the spring-like movement. You won't forget that sensation. But until you've felt what it's like to have that possibility of movement, no exercise or stretching or strengthening will really give you that feeling, because it isn't about stretching muscles. It's about the brain knowing what that movement feels like and repeating it.
Yeah, exactly. Then yeah, so then my train of thought was basically that the body, if the hips are stiff, moves the pelvis and the knee up and down together, right? And in order to break that cycle and be able to sit, I need to picture the pelvis going up while the knee is going down at the same time. So they move each other a little bit, and then the pelvis comes down with the horse's back and the knee relaxes. It shouldn't come up, so it should. And I actively tried actually to stretch my knees forward and down when the pelvis came up. So I created a separation in a way between pelvis and femur, and then I was able to move independently a little bit.
Yeah. Do you have a clear sensory image of the cup of the hip socket and the ball of the femur when you're riding?
It's not something I think about usually. Yeah. Yeah, I don't think so much specifically about that joint. I think back then I was thinking of letting the pelvis swing up and
Yeah,
stretch the knees down. So it was not
yeah.
even so much picturing the joints themselves. Maybe that would have helped. Maybe I would have learned it faster.
But it's interesting because it probably would. It's having a clear
Mhm.
image of the joint, as we showed in the skeleton at the beginning,
Mhm.
does very quickly make a difference in your understanding of how you might use that joint, yeah,
Right.
or organize that joint.
Yeah.
And actually, for most people, the hip joints are not that clear, and I think it's because they're buried in all those muscles which I showed you at the beginning.
I used to be very tight in my
Mm,
hips around my pelvis. So yeah, I didn't have a good sense at all of that. It's
mm.
better now, But yeah, it's interesting. And yeah, the inward rotation of the the femur also frees up the hip joints, I find. If you can rotate your femur inwards in the hip
Yeah,
joint. But in that sense, I was thinking of hip joints to, just trying to recreate, because it's so long ago that I was really
yeah,
working intensively on those things. But yeah, I find that rolling the femur in so you feel like your thigh is resting not on the hamstring but on the adductors, that frees up the hip
yeah,
joints a lot. Whereas if you rotate your femurs out, it seems to block the hip joints somehow, and then you sit more on your hamstrings, or the thigh, the femur rests more on the hamstring than the adductors, and I find that interferes with the freedom of movement.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, that is an interesting one as well, because there will be, we've talked about this before, there will be people who turn their legs out as their natural pattern, and then the rotating the femurs inwards and sending the knees down is a really fantastic way of reorganizing your body. But there will be people who already grip too hard with their knees and turn in too much already. So it depends on your pattern. And then they might actually have to be a little bit more turned out in the hip joints. It's, particularly if you have more of a tendency to extend in your lumbar spine, in other words, arch, then
Mm.
often that goes with a pattern of the knees turning in a little bit, like knock-kneed, and then you might have to rotate out a bit. Yeah. So it's very dependent on your organization. Mm.
That's interesting. Yeah, I tend to be more a sloucher, and I used to have the problem of legs turning out too much. So for me, it
Yes.
really helped to rotate the femurs in and stretch them
Yes.
out.
Mm.
And but then to check whether I'm gripping or not, I engage the muscles on the outside of the femur and try to lift my thighs and knees off a little bit and relax. That I find that that's a good counterbalance too. If you think that you're gripping, and I did that too for a while, I was
Yes.
gripping a lot with my inner thighs, and then this engaging the outside and lifting
Yeah.
off, so on, that helped to break that cycle again.
Yes, and maybe there is this sense that when you find a quality of tone in the muscles of your legs, and for the people who tend to turn their knees out, then maybe the hamstring's a bit freer when you rotate in, and vice versa. That you find this tone which feels connected to the horse's sides, that the horse can kind of breathe into your legs because your legs are soft enough to receive that, and your legs are soft enough to feel the horse's rib cage and to be able to move with the horse's rib cage and also influence the swing of the horse's rib cage. And you can't do that if you're bracing your muscles like crazy.
Exactly. And I mean, I always had a tendency to be tight rather than hypermobile,
Yeah.
and my hamstrings always tended to be tight. And yeah, when my legs turn out, then I feel like I'm sitting on my hamstrings. The hamstrings are then contracted and hard.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I feel like I can't get into the horse. I feel like I'm sort of on top of the horse. I'm stuck. I can't get into the horse, can't get close to the horse. And when I roll my femurs in and open them a little bit, then I find I can sit a lot deeper in the horse. So, but yeah, I mean, somebody with different issues or different conformation may have, different problems and needs a different strategy. Yeah. And that's in a way, that's the danger of, the writing teacher, that we pass on what worked for us,
Yeah.
that may or may not work for the student. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, people are asking a lot about whether there's a difference between the male and female skeleton and female pelvis in terms of rolling the femurs in or out. Um, I've worked with women who have, more of a organization where the legs turn out, and I've worked with men who have an organization where the knees are a bit more in and they're arched. It really depends on the person. I'm sure it does make a slight difference that women's pelvises are shallower and their obviously pelvises are wider. But for me, it's not something so significant. I tend to look at the person in front of me and see what might help them to understand how they can reorganize themselves to be more effective.
And I mean, there are women riders who can rotate their femurs in as much as any man, and have stretched and draped the leg as Otto Kottas, and they're, and vice versa. I mean, it's, I don't know that male female makes a big difference. I mean, maybe there are some conformational features in certain individuals that makes it more difficult for one to rotate in than for another, but I'm not sure that it's a strict gender difference.
No, and actually, I mean, we're all different. We all have our advantages and disadvantages in our structure and our build, if you like. So we're all having to contend with the things that make it more difficult, or the things which make it easier for us. Yeah.
Sam Taylor-Leaton says, I'm sat on my stool practicing rolling femur in and out and rolling out. I feel my muscles tighten up much more. That's what
probably
happens.
Maybe different muscles than you're used to tightening. So according to what your pattern is, some directions will feel so familiar that you won't feel any muscles working at all because they're really used to it. And then you go in the unfamiliar direction and your brain and your body kind of goes, oh, that feels like hard work.
And I mean, it's actually a good suggestion that Sam is making here, that, if you're sitting here on a stool or on an exercise ball, you could try that. Roll your femurs in as far as they go. Like you want to knock your knees together, or like Jackie was saying, like the snow plow and skiing, that position.
Yeah.
That's a picture that used to help me, heels away from the horse and then roll the femur in, knees together. That used to help me. And then you could do the opposite and ride like Charlie Chaplin, and just see what happens. Essentially, it's like what feels better, what feels worse, and then when you're back on the horse, then try that and see, when do I feel like I'm closer to the horse, with which femur position do I feel like I'm in the deepest, closest position to the horse that I can be in, and then rolling it one way or another maybe gives you the feeling that you're getting pushed out of the saddle and sort of away from the horse, that now I can't feel very much anymore. It's also an issue of the area, the size of the area in which you're in contact with the horse. Like if I roll my femurs in, my area of contact is as large as it can be, right? If I roll my femurs out, then I only have a very small strip that's in touch, and then the knees are out, of course, so I lose the whole knee as a sensor and as an aid, and I just have a small strip of the hamstring and a small strip in the back of the calf, and then I feel like I can't feel anything. I can't feel the horse anymore. I can't communicate effectively, and when I roll them in, then I have several times larger area of contact, and then I get a lot more information, of course. The larger the contact area is, that's always something that is in the back of my mind too, that I need as much area of contact touching the horse so I get more information.
I think it's interesting what you said about, finding these ranges, because how you can take that on is to gradually decrease the range of turning in and turning out until it becomes so small that it's almost an oscillation, a little bit in, a little bit out, and then refine that even more so it disappears. And that will tend to be a place that's fairly neutral for you. It's a great way. You start with a big range and you gradually decrease it until it disappears. And that will be a kind of neutral sweet spot for you. That's another kind of exercise that you can play around with while you're not riding.
Yeah, very true. I've also noticed that in teaching lessons that some people seem to brace their knees rather than their pelvis or hip joints. Like sometimes looking at a rider, I get the sense that the knee is rigid and femur and lower leg are not separated enough or not independent enough of each other. And looking at the pelvis and the femur, I feel like they seem to be okay. They move. Femur and hip joint, they seem to move, but the knee seems braced and locked.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, that's, again, I think that's something about having a clear awareness of all the possibilities of movement in each individual joint and how each individual joint relates to the next joint, the joint above and below. And that may be just as a consequence of that someone just isn't clear that they don't need to work so hard with the muscles in their back of the leg and keep the angle of the knee the same all the time. And it's only when you feel what it's like not to work so hard that you kind of recognize, oh, I was doing too much. Right. Yeah. It's probably a balance thing and a gripping to stop falling over. I think most things result from that.
Yeah, it's probably best to get stability, I would think. And, the knee joint has to flex and extend a little bit too, so the lower leg can hang and be quiet. So the lower leg is sort of in one place and doesn't really move much, but the femur moves up and down, pelvis moves up and down, which means the knee joint has to open and close, and also the ankles actually have to flex and extend a little bit, because as gravity pulls your seat down, it pulls your leg down, and when you have somebody with a really good leg position, you can see in a sitting trot that when the horse lands, the heel drops slightly and then comes back up to neutral, right? So there's always a slight down and down and up kind of movement, and if there's any tension in the leg, that doesn't happen.
Yeah. I mean, I'm definitely someone, when I lose balance, I stiffen my ankles. Definitely, that's one of my patterns, and it turns up in everything that I do. So the beauty of that is that it means that I can pay attention to it and work on it in all sorts of situations, whether it's running, where I can actually just really feel like I can carry my foot really loosely off the end of my lower leg rather than holding it tense, or walking, or whether it's more dynamic sports like riding or skiing. There's so many questions here. I'm not sure we're going to be able to get to one. There's just tons of them, and they're all really interesting.
But just to continue that discussion about the leg, like we started with the pelvis, now we're kind of working our way down. There are people who can sit the trot without stirrups, but not with stirrups. And I found that's because the ankle is stiff. Somehow they're holding tension.
That is me. Absolutely. I mean, I can now, but I did not find it difficult to sit the trot without stirrups. But the moment I had stirrups, it was really hard. But I have learned the sensation of my ankle kind of bouncing.
Exactly.
And then when I could bounce my ankle, I could sit it with stirrups. But it took quite a while. And actually, I seem to remember the thing which really made the difference, which may be interesting for the people who've asked about sitting trot. There's been lots of questions about sitting trot. Was feeling the movement of my pelvis around the head of my femur. And when I felt what I needed to do with my pelvis, then my legs were able to relax and drop, because I wasn't so worried, obviously, internally about falling off.
Yeah, makes sense.
So it was something about really being able to match the movement of the horse with my pelvis moving around my hip joints. That really helped for me.
Maybe especially in the sitting trot, some people might feel that the stirrup blocks the movement of the leg, the downward movement, and I mean, I've had that too at certain times in my riding, and I think I try to picture my ankle or heel dropping below the stirrup, so that the stirrup is not an obstacle that prevents my heel and ankle from moving down. So, but just even thinking, it's not a limit really. The foot can drop down, the ankle, the heel can drop down below the stirrup iron. That seemed to help. Just maybe even just imagining that, picturing the foot going down below the stirrup iron.
Yeah, actually, I think that's a really good point, is that, to have these sort of visual images and then these sensory images which match the visual image. This is my ankle, by the way, dropping down below the spirit, just in case you wondered. The heel of the hand, in a way, it's quite a good way to get the feeling of what's possible in the ankle. We are more mobile in our hands, but
toes are supported by the stirrup, and then
exactly, and then there's a sort of a bounce. But and if you can get that feeling, and have the visual, I think it can really help.
And it should be down from neutral and back up to neutral, and it should not be from neutral up. you know, because if the hips are tight, you know, then the ankle will go up and maybe it will go down to neutral. Often it won't, it will stay up permanently.
Well, this is an interesting one, Thomas, because actually people have a tendency to lift their heels up. That tends to go more with a pattern of being a little bit extended in the spine. People who drop their heels down when they get tense, that tends to go more with rounding the spine or being slouched. So yeah, it's and
it's true. You often see people with a hollow back perched forward and then the heels up and the knees
exactly. Yeah, because a hollow back is in the direction of taking you forward, as if you were going to start a sprint. So of course you're going to fall forward because that's where you're already going. Whereas the slouchy ones will fall backwards and get really super flexed in the ankles, knees, and hips.
That's interesting, huh?
So many questions. You may have to kind of continue the discussion in the Feldenkrais group.
Exactly. So Manuela Göttlicher says the stirrup is a turning point. Would that be a good picture? Yeah, you can. I was just actually, as we were talking about it, I was thinking about that on some level, yeah, the stirrup is like the center of a circle, and then your ankle almost draws a mini circle around that stirrup line. I think that's a possible, picture that you could use.
That reminds me of, really good cyclists. They always think about the circle of a pedal rather than the push down and the pull up. And then your ankle has to be super available to be able to find that smooth circle, so that there's no part of the rotation which is jerky.
Interesting. So Lee Nuffield says, do you drop alternate heels when you try to at least emphasize one than the other? So the horse is using one hip than the other. I don't. I try to keep the legs hanging, because if I emphasize the downward movement on one side, that's a weight aid, then I shift my weight into whatever leg of the horse is on the ground on that side. That becomes sort of a stirrup aid, almost a stirrup pressure. And that changes the way the horse moves, for better or for worse. So I do it when I want to create a certain weight shift, right? And that can be super effective. But I wouldn't do it automatically always, Anything that you do mechanically, actively, every stride, that tends not to be productive. It can
exactly
disturb the movement of the horse, and ultimately the horse will tune you out, probably, and maybe brace against it, because it's like a disturbance in the movement in a way. If it's monotonous every stride, it's like driving every stride. In the German riding schools, we were taught that, drive every stride, and that's silly, of course. It's like a dripping faucet. It can drive you nuts at first, and then eventually you don't hear it anymore. And it's the same. The sensitive horses will get really irritated, and eventually they'll probably tune it out too. But the lazy ones, they tune it out right away because it obviously carries no meaning, right? So let's see here. Anthony Woods here was on the Q&As. I don't know, Catherine, if you can see the Q&A section.
Yeah, I can actually.
There are some six questions. Anthony says, I've gotten great contact recently by keeping my leg on in contact with the earth. My leg has stopped swinging. Would this not make the swinging happen again? Now that was early on, I don't know.
Probably from earlier, yeah. We might have to. You might have to answer again ask again in the group, Anthony. So we know what it's related to.
I mean, you should have contact between your leg and the horse, but not by gripping. I used to picture like a Velcro contact between lower leg. So it's not created by muscle, but it's more like it's adhesive somehow. It's or like horse's belly being like a magnet and my leg being like a piece of iron that gets sucked in, so it's not an active muscle action to keep contact, but it's more like a passive thing, that the contact, happens through being balanced and then relaxing the leg. And actually a little bit of swinging is not that bad. You just don't want the banging. Sometimes you see riders where the lower legs get bounced off the horse's belly, probably because the horse is still stiff too and rejecting the leg and pushing the leg away, right? And you get these funny, looking movements. But a gentle swinging is okay. I mean, if really good riders with a really supple seat, everything moves.
See that? Yeah, I personally, I don't really I think that a little bit of movement in the leg and in the joints of the leg is probably more sophisticated than a leg that's held really still and fixed.
Absolutely.
That was what I would say. I mean, I can't be sure. I'm not a good enough rider to really know for sure. But when I see riders who I go, that is a picture of really effortless coordination. There is some movement in the leg joints, and there is a little bit of, it's not just,
If you force the contact, if you force a quiet seat or quiet leg, then you become stiff and rigid, and then you actually get bounced away from the horse, and then the legs get noisier as a result. The hands usually also, bouncy and noisy. So everything has to move a little bit, and it has to come out of balance, and then letting the legs hang down and relaxing the arm muscles so that the muscles around the spine really create the balance, the deep spine muscles,
I think it's funny, Thomas, because actually, of course, what's happening is we're crossing into the topic from yesterday, and we're crossing in the topic to tomorrow. We're going to talk about quiet lower legs, and I'm absolutely sure we'll be talking about hip joints, pelvis, spine, knees, exactly. So it's because it's a whole. We're always talking about the global whole. And of course, also, the psychological side is hugely significant in how we use our bodies and organize our bodies. So, and then,
it's all connected, and one joint affects another one, or one muscle affects another one. So you can't separate it. And it's the same in the horse. All the different body parts are connected, and all the different muscles are connected, and there are these chains of transmission of movement or tension, bracing, and so on. It's really interesting. So it's interesting to look at the same thing from different angles, and then see how it all connects back to everything else. So we always talk about everything in every session. So even if the focus is more, on the lumbar spine or more on the pelvis or something, everything else comes up too.
Yeah.
And
but hopefully everyone has joined the Shanna's doing it now. The Facebook group, and then we can continue the discussion in there, which would be
Okay, so many good questions.
Yes.
Hard to answer them all here. Just let me read briefly if there's anything else we want to pick out. Then Stephanie Dobbis was saying, I have found that when the shoulders are the least bit forward, being able to move the pelvis properly to sit the trot is impossible. Yeah, that's true. Then you're not in balance. And for me, there was a certain posture when the shoulders were a little bit too far forward, where I felt like the horse's movement would push my pelvis up into my rib cage, and it jammed. Yeah, exactly. And that was it blocked me from really following the swing of the horse's back. And then if I brought the shoulders a little bit back behind that point, I felt like my pelvis could swing freely, slightly in front of my rib cage. Now, I don't know if I was sitting vertically and it just felt like my pelvis was in front of my rib cage, or if I was really a little bit behind the vertical. I don't know, but it was just this image of my pelvis has to be free to move up and down, and it can't get jammed into the rib cage from below. So that would be an interesting thing to get a visual feedback, so to speak, when you with these things.
I think that there's definitely something about when your shoulders are balanced over your pelvis. Actually, kind of what happens is the muscles, the core muscles, stop gripping so much, and then you've got a little bit more possibility of the lumbar vertebra to upwards to absorb the movement. Whereas if you're tipped forward, then your back muscles will be gripping like crazy to stop you falling, and then your lumbar spine is kept stiff, and you can't absorb, and then you get that banging feeling. It's pretty much what happens, I would say. Yeah. So
it's been about an hour, I guess. So maybe everybody could post their questions in the group, Facebook group, and then we can look in there and answer some of the questions there. Yeah. Well, see, we've had 132 participants after all, even though it was
despite the glitches. Hopefully we'll be back on Facebook tomorrow.
Yeah, hopefully they fixed it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, then thanks everybody for watching. Thank you for casting.
Yeah, thank you. And see you tomorrow, I hope.
Hopefully getting
Take care, everybody. Stay safe is the new thing we say. Stay safe. All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.